Today, obviously, we're all here for Ben Bland's new book. It's called the Hong Kong's Post-Handover Generation, Searching for Identity in China's Shadow. He actually coined the title himself. It's called Generation HK, if I've got that right. It's a very powerful look, not just at the issues affecting Hong Kong, many of which we're familiar with, but the issues in particular impacting the young people of Hong Kong and where they will go from here. As it's described itself, young people have little attachment to, say, the British era rule in Hong Kong, but increasingly they feel perhaps less attachment to the modern-day Chinese rule also. They're falling somewhere in between, and that, I think, is what Ben is trying to examine in his book. It's a coming-of-age story for Generation Hong Kong and reflecting the struggles and the issues that they're facing despite the gleaming facade of this modern world city. The book is available at the front of the restaurant here today, and it will also be on Kindle and hopefully in all good bookstores around Hong Kong. Ben is the South China correspondent for the Financial Times. He is now based in Hong Kong. He was previously a FT correspondent in Indonesia and Vietnam, and previous to that he was with the Daily Telegraph in London. He's also a graduate of the University of Cambridge. The way we're going to work today is Ben will do a very short reading of the book, just a short excerpt to set the tone. Then I will ask him some questions and we'll throw it open to the floor. You're very welcome to ask your questions, given the opportunity we have Ben then as well. So that's roughly how it played out. So, Ben, I invite you to the podium.
First up, I'd just like to thank the FCC for having me here today speaking for the first time. As some of you know, I'm normally on the other side of the stage, thinking of the fiendishly difficult questions to ask, so I hope you all return the favour presently. I'm just going to read a very short extract from the book, as Enda said, to set the tone. This is from a chapter called The Professional Democrats, which is about some of the professionals in Hong Kong, lawyers, doctors, insurance brokers, who people traditionally thought of as being very mainstream, not interested in politics, just interested in making money, getting promoted, getting ahead and staying out of politics. And this looks at how some of these young professionals have really been seized by the political moment in Hong Kong to jump into activism. And this section is about a doctor, an accident and emergency doctor called Kwong Po-yin, who works in a government hospital. And she was actually the first umbrella activist to later be elected as a district councillor in 2015. This is about her transformation from mindless careerist to frontline activist. Kwong was in the streets when the first tear gas canisters were fired. She helped to provide first aid. All the things you can imagine or not imagine happened that night, she recalled. What impressed me most was two young girls, secondary school students, I guess, holding each other and crying. They were not afraid. They were just asking each other why the government is treating them like this when they're doing something good for Hong Kong. Kwong describes the umbrella revolution as an epiphany. If teenagers are willing to fight bravely for the cause, then adults should step up as well, Kwong thought. We can't just sit here and hope there'll be someone else to save us, said the doctor. Kwong believes Hong Kong faces three main and interlinked problems. Firstly, an invasion of people from mainland China, which is straining public services and threatening Hong Kong's way of life. Secondly, a decline in social mobility driven by the territory's dwindling economic prospects and the failure of the self-interested political and business elite to act. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the diminution of the values and freedoms that make Hong Kong distinct from the rest of China. I was taken aback by her anger towards Chinese immigrants in Hong Kong. It was visceral, much like the anti-immigration sentiments sweeping other parts of the world, from supporters of Donald Trump to backers of Britain's exit from the European Union. The influx today is too large, and social services are not capable of making them dissolve well in society, she said of the mainlanders. They have condensed and become something solid. Like so many other people I talked to, she felt that the majority of mainlanders in Hong Kong were unwilling or unable to understand Hong Kong's values and culture. In a similar way to Joshua Wong and the student leaders, she saw democracy and freedom as fundamental to the Hong Kong identity, and even more, the essence of the city itself.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben, for that excerpt. Well, look, I'll kick off proceedings then, as I said. Given that you've coined the phrase Generation HK, maybe you can just flesh out a little bit what you mean by that and explain to the audience what you consider to be the new Generation HK.
I think in basic terms, I define Generation HK as those who came of age since the handover. So that doesn't necessarily mean only those who were born after the handover, but perhaps those who were 18 or younger in 1997 who've effectively lived all their adult life in the new Hong Kong, the Hong Kong of one country, two systems. So that's the basic definition. I think more generally I would characterize them as more outspoken and politically engaged with issues in Hong Kong than their parents were. Like many children of baby boomers around the world, they've somehow benefited from the economic progress that went before, but they've also faced a lot of the problems such as higher property prices, lower wage growth, etc. And then I think there's an identity question which you alluded to into your introduction, which is that these people never really felt much connection to the British history. So when, for example, at the weekend we had Xi Jinping talking about the humiliation of the colonial era, to these young Hong Kongers, to Generation HK, that's pretty meaningless because they had minimal experience of the British era. At the same time, I think they're less connected to the mainland than their parents and grandparents, many of whom would have been refugees from the mainland or people who'd come to Hong Kong seeking opportunity. But these people spent most of their adult life in Hong Kong, which has really defined, I think, their worldview.
And what's driving this kind of new sense of identity? Is it strictly related to not wanting the system or not sharing the value system and the system of governance that mainland China has? Or is it more driven by domestic issues such as sky-high property prices, inability to advance your career very much due to competition, etc., etc.? I mean, is it more homegrown or is it linked to mainland China?
It's a really difficult question to answer. I mean, if everyone in the room thinks to themselves, where are you from? And then you ask yourself the question, what does it mean to be a Dubliner? What does it mean to be, from the People's Republic of China? What does it mean to be American? It's actually pretty hard to answer these questions. And one of the things I found as I went around Hong Kong talking to political activists, the people in education, the arts, business about their lives, when I asked them what it means to be a Hong Konger, people were actually pretty stumped. But people soon come back to these sense of, on the one hand, core values, which many young people would say things like they want democracy, they respect freedom of speech and human rights, they have a sense of fairness and order in society. In many ways, all those values are kind of the inverse of what they imagine mainland China to be. Then there's the cultural question, of course, where a lot of young people, to a certain extent, like other Hong Kongers, treasure the Cantonese language, the use of traditional characters. But again, that's kind of linked to being the inverse of the mainland, at least in their imagination and their view.
And how much traction does this Hong Kong identity have, per se? I mean, is it a widely held view amongst Generation HK? Could it be resolved with better social policies by the local government? Or is it something that's ingrained now and won't be going away for generations to come?
It's hard to say. I mean, obviously in my book I've spoken to quite a few outspoken people. As journalists, as foreign correspondents, as writers, we don't go out there to find the 90% of people with nothing interesting to say. But I think if you look at the survey data from the respected Hong Kong University Public Opinion Programme, you can see these very clear trends among young people of the Hong Kong identity getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and the inverse happening, that those Hong Kongers who say they're ethnically Chinese or Chinese really falling. I think the latest survey had the number of Hong Kongers aged 18 to 29 who describe themselves as broadly Chinese dropping to 3%, an all-time low, and down from about 30% at the time of the handover. So I think there is an identity question that's at the heart of a lot of these issues. In a way, it's linked to the politics and the economics, but I think it's partly separate. And one thing I found when I went to talk to the second and third generation tycoons to ask them what the problem was, you get these very pat answers about, just give people cheap housing, look at Singapore, they have HDBs, and so long as people have those, as long as young people have a roof over their heads, they'll keep quiet. I think there's certainly an element of that frustration with inequality, which you find in London, in New York, in many places, but I think there's something else too, and cheap housing isn't enough, and perhaps if it was before, I think the game has changed quite significantly in the last few years.
Well, that seems to me to be very important. If it goes beyond just cheap housing and the likes of things to keep a young population happy, is it then the case that these would-be revolutionaries are on something of a collision course with Beijing? And bearing in mind we had a pretty strong speech over the weekend, is that the course we're on, or can it still be diverted, do you think?
Well, perhaps like some people here, I had a very strange Saturday morning where at around 9, 10 a.m. I watched President Xi Jinping's relatively tough talking speech when he warned Hong Kongers not to challenge the authority of the central government, not to question China's sovereignty. And then in the afternoon I went to report on the pro-democracy protests when people were very much doing all those things that they've been told not to do. And I think there is an extent to which there's a vicious circle here where since Occupy I think we've seen a lot of young Hong Kongers become more radical, more active in their challenge to Beijing's rule. At the same time, I think as the Chinese government sees that, they've become concerned. They're obviously always very sensitive to any suggestion of separatism, not just in Hong Kong, but in any part of the People's Republic of China. So I think they've increased their level of threat to Hong Kong since this movement has emerged, and as a result, young people are pushing back harder. So I think there is a real risk that young people in Hong Kong and the Beijing government are really on a quite worrying collision course right now.
So perhaps China is worsening the situation in terms of how it's responding to the attitudes on the ground. Are these young people, do they feel like they are being adequately represented? I mean, we see this around the world. We had the most recent example was the UK election, where there was a sense that young people came out in their droves, but it's not quite clear who and what they're voting for exactly. Are the young people of Hong Kong, are they confident that they have the right lobby groups, the right representatives to speak for them, notwithstanding obviously the restrictions on democracy here, but are they happy with their leadership?
Well, I think it's fascinating that elsewhere in the world there's a lot of hand-wringing about the political apathy of young people, and here the Hong Kong government and Beijing have the opposite problem. I think young people have become too active politically from their perspective. I mean, they're constantly talking about the need for young people to be less political. But what was fascinating for me as well, you had these other Occupy movements elsewhere around the world, in Wall Street, in the City of London, the UK's financial centre. It was just the usual anti-capitalist protesters, the environmentalists. After a few weeks of not showering in a tent, they all went back to university or their jobs working in probably investment banks. Here it was different. It was, Occupy in a way failed in its objectives, but it was this accelerant for youth politicization. And we saw, these guys going from their tents to the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, which is quite an incredible phenomenon. Now, of course, it's important to highlight that already 2 of them have been kicked out, and another 4 are facing a court case from the Hong Kong government. So I think young people briefly felt they were sort of represented. I think that is changing pretty rapidly.
I mean, if you think back to Occupy, I think there's a feeling now or a sense that perhaps the leadership has fractured somewhat and some of the goals have become more disparate. Was Occupy peak pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, or could we ever see something like that happen again, given the internal divisions that we read about?
I think it's really hard to say. I mean, journalists, like political scientists, economists and pollsters have a pretty terrible record of predictions recently everywhere around the world, so I'm not going to get into that game. But I think one of the contradictions that I'm trying to get at in the book is that, in a way, to be an activist or to have a dream, means that seems impossible, but it's always impossible until it happens. So I think people haven't given up, but certainly even amongst the young political activists and even people who aren't activists but are politically active, there's a lot of splits between the people who are calling for full independence, the people who are calling for a referendum which perhaps amounts to something similar, then those who say no, we just need full democracy. They spend about as much time fighting with each other at the moment as they do with the Hong Kong government or Beijing, but that's the nature of politics, I think.
It's people's Judea in front kind of stuff. Before we open up for questions, I do want to ask you, you have a chapter in there on education. I can't say it's something I've especially given much thought to, but can you just detail why some of the seeds of inequality are being sown through the Hong Kong education system and what the problems are there that you have identified in your book?
Well, I think it's important to realise that the precedent for Occupy was scholarism, which was a movement led by Joshua Wong and others against the so-called sort of moral and national education curriculum, which would have promoted a sort of pro-Chinese Communist Party view of China in Hong Kong schools. But I think beyond that, there was a sense that these young people were already very frustrated with the education system, which I think is very heavily reliant on rote learning and a really cutthroat level of competition, which doesn't leave students very happy, puts a lot of pressure on them. And when you talk to business people, yeah, I do, as I'm sure you do too, I don't think you get the sense that it really provides the graduates and the skills that Hong Kong needs for its economy either. So that's a bit of a lose-lose situation, but what I found fascinating in the book was talking to these super tutors who make millions of US dollars a year by giving kids the answers to their all-important university entrance exams. And they've kind of found a way to build a business, build a sort of celebrity image. I mean, YY Lam, the most famous of them all, you know, his posters are everywhere on buses, in train stations. He has his own magazine. So amid this very dysfunctional education system, you know, he is a young Hong Konger, I think 27 years old, has built this business. So it shows that there is a strong desire to be pragmatic and to thrive in this difficult situation, but it also, the fact that these kind of cramming schools exist, and they're very strange places, shows the real tensions, not just at a political level, but even in the education system. And I think so long as the politics in Hong Kong are so divided, it's very hard for any government or even civil society to tackle some of these issues. And that's probably something that, you know, the Beijing central government, Hong Kong government, and many young activists would agree on, that as long as there's so much division, it's really hard to see a way forward on some of these sort of nuts and bolts issues, let alone the more complex things like universal suffrage or national security laws.
And so is education essentially a homegrown problem? It's not a legacy of British rule, and it's not necessarily linked to Chinese rule either. Is it a homegrown problem?
I don't know. I wouldn't comment on the end of humiliation caused by British colonial rule. I'm sure it did mess up a lot of things. So I'm not saying the British are absolved of any issues, but I think there's a lot of it comes from parental and societal pressure, actually. You know, it's parents wanting their kids to do well, it's kids being very competitive with each other, but there are also other factors at play. I think only around 1/5 of Hong Kong students can ever get access to a state-sponsored place at university, so that creates a real chokehold, whereas in the UK, something like half of school leavers are going to university, so when there's so few government-funded university places available, people compete to get into the best high school, to have the best chance of university, and then there's kind of like a trickle-down effect. So then they have to get coaching to get into a good primary school, and to get into a good primary school, you need interview coaching when you go into kindergarten, etc. So it leads to a pretty dysfunctional system, and I think there are all sorts of reasons for that. It's not just one thing.
Sure. Okay, I'll give yourselves an opportunity then. We have one hand. Maybe if you could just say your name, please, at the start, and someone will bring a microphone to you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Rouse, and I interviewed Ben this morning on the radio. We took part in a discussion together. I thought, I have a comment, first of all, and then a double-barreled question, if that's okay. First of all, thank you for that very brief extract. I think it's a bit of a cheat, because I'm going to now have to buy the book, because I found it very interesting. So maybe that was the whole purpose of the lunch. Another speaker in this venue talked about 3 waves. One was 1989, when, because of the events in the square, 1 million Hong Kong people marched in Hong Kong, shepherded by 800 policemen who actually took off their weapons and left them in the police station armories because they wanted to show solidarity with the people who were marching. A truly extraordinary event, and not a single window broken or a car overturned or anything. Very peaceful demonstrations. And then 2003 with the 500,000 march. And both of those, to some extent, linked to people who understood the mainland and, in a sense, were interacting with mainland politics. Whereas Occupy was, if I like, half a length away from that, in that it was very Hong Kong centric. What are you doing to us? So I think my question is, to what extent, because you're the South China correspondent, to what extent do you think some of these emotions have flowed over the border? And to what extent do you think this shaped some of the things that President Xi said at the weekend?
Well, I think the flow over the border is obviously highly limited by things like the Great Firewall, which means that people in the mainland aren't reading unbiased accounts of what's happening in Hong Kong if they're reading anything at all about it. And when I spend time in Guangdong province, in Guangzhou, Dongguan, other cities, I think most people there feel a frustration with Hong Kong. There's a view that Hong Kong is the sort of the spoiled child. They were given all these economic goodies, and now they're throwing it back in our face, and they don't even want our money anymore, and they look down on us, but actually we're richer than them. Why do we even want to go to Hong Kong and buy your stupid baby milk? I can go to Paris and buy 10 Louis Vuittons. And I think some of that is genuine feeling. Obviously, some of that is conditioned by the sort of propaganda that people are getting in the mainland. I mean, it's important to say that there were some mainland activists who protested in sympathy with Occupy or who came over here, and some of those people were detained and charged and put away by the security state in China. So it's not an easy environment in which to have an open discussion about these sorts of issues. But I certainly think there's a frustration there, and I think that was certainly seemed to me to be reflected in some of the things that Xi Jinping was saying, and I definitely think that some of his message, or in fact much of it, wasn't really directed at the 7.4 million people in Hong Kong, but the 1.4 billion people back at home in the mainland.
Yep, certainly. Just at the end, please.
Rachel Carden. I'd like to ask, when you were doing your research, were you more or less restricted to people who could speak at least a modicum of English? Or were you able to delve more deeply into the working class young people here? And I'm thinking of a subset of that. The immigration is a fascinating topic here, and Hong Kong people's attitudes to it, which I think are actually quite often based on illusion. I was very interested, of course, in that excerpt that you're reading, because certainly originally the immigration was mainly based cross-border marriages. It would be a mainland wife and coming to join her Hong Kong husband. So the children of those marriages must now be growing up as Hong Kongers. And I was just wondering if there was any sense of their feelings about the place and so on that you were able to glean.
Well, I don't speak Cantonese. I did have some translation help, so I was able to interview some people, but mostly I was limited to people who speak English. But I do think the people I spoke to were from all social classes. I mean, the biggest problem wasn't talking to working class people, it was talking to the upper class people. Very few of who wanted to talk to me openly about the sorts of issues Hong Kong is facing. But I think it's not just a question of whether or not people have mainland heritage or not. I mean, if you take the example of Nathan Law, the youngest ever legislator who was elected last year, may soon be removed. He was born in Shenzhen. He lived there until he was 6 years old. He went to what he called a pro-China or red school. So I don't think it's simply a question of whether or not people have mainland heritage, and some of the more idealistic young Hongers talk about these values in a more open sense. So some of them seeing it as being a closed, competitive thing with the mainland. Others think, no, anyone who agrees with the points of democracy, freedom, can be a Hong Konger. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, if I may praise my rival, had a really good story the other day about the mainlanders who are enjoying the freedoms of Hong Kong and who actually have really bought into the system here. So I guess I agree with your sentiment. The idea that all mainlanders are against freedom, etc., is obviously a complete stereotype and not accurate.
So it's a bit perplexing and distressing, isn't it, that your A&E doctor is still clinging on to those attitudes that used to be, so current, that all our troubles are caused by mainlanders, and they're now just taking a different form. I mean, I think but there's so many fascinating topics. I mean, the way that racism is very readily accepted here, even amongst middle class people, are not ashamed to be racist. In some cases, it's really quite interesting as compared with the West.
Thank you. We'll work down. This gentleman, please.
Hello, my name's Evan Fowler. I'm a recovering depressive. But prior to that, I wrote for the House News and a bit for the Stand News. And was a quiet partner in co-founding the Hong Kong Free Press. Actually, I have to say something. I am still on medication. I consider this whole subject not a matter of interest, but something very personal. And for me, seeing how Hong Kong has reacted to the umbrella movement had a huge impact. I just want to make one correction first, and that is you referred to Occupy and you made comparisons with Occupy protests that had occurred in other parts of the world. I think one thing that the organisers had made very clear from the start was that it was very unfortunate that the name in English was translated as Occupy Central with Love and Peace. There was, in actual fact, another Occupy Central that occurred at around that time that occupies were happening in London and New York. So I think it's very important not to muddy the water there. I was wondering when you interviewed all the people who were part of Generation Hong Kong. Did you get any information regarding their actual sort of the political allegiances of their background? Because I think most of us who are part Chinese or fully Chinese here know full well that the concept of being Chinese is itself quite an interesting idea. I personally don't use the word China all the time when referring to the mainland. Of course, the mainland is the PRC, and I think there was a feeling in 1997 that a lot of people thought that by accepting Beijing, Hong Kong being returned to Beijing, that and giving Beijing face, not rebelling against that, Beijing would certainly sort of hold by certain obligations, in some ways give face back to Hong Kong. And my feeling is that a lot of the young in Hong Kong have, depending on the families in which they come from, they have been influenced by their outlook. It's not just anti-mainland, it depends on their family backgrounds.
Yeah, as I said, I think it's not a simple question, and I think it's important to highlight all identities, to a great extent, are defined against others. Being Scottish right now definitely means not being English. Being British means not being French. Canadians always put the flag on their backpack to show that they're not Americans because everyone hears them and thinks they are. Similarly, Kiwis. So I don't think it's unique to Hong Kong, this idea of defining yourself against others. And I'm not suggesting that all people who do that are in any way racist. But there's clearly an issue. And on the other side, of course, the question is the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party is really trying to own the concept of being Chinese, not just within the borders of the People's Republic, but even for all Chinese people everywhere in the world.
Thanks for the question. I will keep going this way, please. This lady. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Laura. I'm a journalist based in Beijing and here for a few days to cover the anniversary. It's been quite easy to talk to young people, middle, lower class, people of all kinds. It seems clear this grievance about being left out more and more. But it's quite difficult to talk at another level, and you were mentioning interviews with tycoons, young tycoons. I wonder if, do you have a sense that there is a similar grievance at a higher level? I mean, competition is competition. We see who's buying the land, who's getting this. So I don't know how much they're telling you, but do you feel that, because if the same grievances touch a different kind of class, which is also politically more powerful, that might be a different story to tell. I wonder what has been your experience reporting from here. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I've reported in quite a number of countries in Asia, and it's never easy to talk to the tycoons who control the economies of most of the places I've worked, whether it's Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam. It was really hard to get people to talk seriously here. I had a few meetings where people just gave these pat answers about, give the people cheap housing, give the people cheap housing. Oh, by the way, I want to build it so long as the government gives me the land cheap and subsidises the construction cost. But I did manage to meet one guy, Lau Meng Wai, who's the head of the Government Youth Commission. He's a second-generation property tycoon, a polymath. He's a trained pilot, lawyer, academic. Now he runs his dad's property business after his dad quit because he's a fugitive from justice in Macau. So quite an interesting story, and he was the only person I met from the tycoon class who was willing to have an honest conversation with me. And he actually spoke about the identity vacuum that even he grew up in. So he said, when I was growing up, I had this British passport thing, but there was just some unicorn on this black bit of leather cover, and it was meaningless to me. But equally, he spoke about how he didn't really feel much connection to the mainland either, even though he personally and his family has business interests there. So I think definitely this Hong Kong identity does actually reach across to other people. Most of the Hong Kong tycoons like being in Hong Kong. They do business in the mainland and with the mainland, but you don't see many of them wanting to retire to Shenzhen, certain former chief executives accepted. And I won't say any more about that. So I think the identity is actually shared, but obviously for those with money and interests, it's more easy to do a deal and put your concerns on the back burner. And I think also on the flip side, if you have these identity issues and you also feel like your education system is putting too much pressure on you and you can't afford a house, obviously those issues exacerbate themselves too.
This gentleman here, please.
Paul Schulte from UST. So I've been here since '92, and when I went down to talk to people who were during the Umbrella Revolution, sitting in their tents for 2 months, I was struck by the inchoate sort of argument of what they're doing. Why are they there? They didn't know why they were there, except that there was something about democracy. And I'm so struck because I think this is fundamentally economic. And I wouldn't be so cavalier as to say that it's just because we there's no housing. You're talking about families of 9 or 10 people living in 400 square feet. Truly uncivilized, right? Ridiculous, absurd. And so I wouldn't throw that out the window as being, just a discomfort or an irrelevance. But my question is, I think that when we're looking at this, we're looking at an economy which is completely balkanized and is a city where we have a Gini coefficient, which is one of the most extreme in the world, of one industry after another run by 2 companies or 3 companies, where you have a balkanized, oligopoly in virtually every single part of the economy of Hong Kong, which is a lock. And so it's exacerbated. And I was in New York last week talking to university students there, and it's exactly the same thing. You cannot live on $42,000 a year in New York City, or you will be living in poverty. And so how do you go with that in terms of people leaving into the workforce in balkanized industries where there is no chance of advancement?
Well, I think it's definitely true. I mean, quite a lot of the young people I spoke to, mention these issues, and I think their alienation is also as much from the own elite in Hong Kong, as well as the Chinese government. So I think that's an important point. And of course, as I said earlier, these issues are felt similarly by young people in London, in New York, in Jakarta, in Taipei. I think what's different here is the political situation exacerbates it for a number of reasons. One, there's nowhere to go if you're a Hong Konger, right? You only have this city. I mean, technically people can go and work in the mainland under certain circumstances, but in people's minds, young people, it's not something many want to do, though some do and do it happily. So I think there's A, the fact of a limited amount of space, but B, the political overlay that so many of these issues are linked to the political dysfunctionality of Hong Kong. I mean, quite a few people recently have given me this example of Uber facing a lot of legal issues in Hong Kong and pointing out that the people who own the taxi badges ultimately, are represented in the Legislative Council through functional constituencies. So there's a sort of systemic inertia. These people who ultimately provide support to the Hong Kong government and to Beijing's objectives also happen to have monopoly licenses, and there's certainly extent to which, as I was saying earlier to the lady over here, that the tycoons, the business interests, and also foreign business interests too in Hong Kong, want to work with the Chinese government, want to work with the Hong Kong government to keep their own interests and keep people under control. And I think there's a lot of frustration with that.
Thanks for the question. Gentleman behind.
Thank you. I'm Stefano Mariani. A question, I suppose, buttressed by a comment. Aren't we not now witnessing the process of, shall we say, ethnogenesis in Hong Kong? If one takes the Benedict Anderson view of nationalism, that it's an imagined community. There's no such thing as a primordial national community. It's when a sufficiently large group of people starts thinking on the same terms, using the same symbols, the same ideals, even the same slogans. Perhaps Hong Kong has now reached that critical stage where it's beginning to bud off from the more broad corpus of Sinic civilization, perhaps not unlike the way the various Korean kingdoms and Japan, whilst adopting the broad corpus of Chinese culture during the Han and Tang dynasties, subsequently went off in their own directions. Now they don't consider themselves Chinese anymore. And to follow up on the gentleman's very apposite comment over there about the slippery notion of Chinese identity, what's always fascinated me is that China has historically only existed as a geographic concept. That is, the geographic space occupied by a given dynasty. The various dynasties of Chinese history always referred to themselves in a political sense as Tang, Sui, Qing, whatever. The geographic space which they occupied was China, but they were their dynastic name. So now that, with the greatest respect, I mean, the mainland China has, I suppose, what you could call negative political capital, or negative soft power. So it's unattractive. It is unattractive to be perceived as Chinese. It has nothing attractive to offer to the people of Hong Kong. It's perceived to be a place of, shall we say, low quality, low character, low manners, and therefore it actively puts off Hong Kongers from identifying as Chinese. I think that's a trigger point. And I was wondering whether you had any sense of whether we're moving towards, I suppose, the creation of a new national identity.
I think it's a very interesting question as someone who's studied Southeast Asian history and the rise of nationalism in Asia. I'm also a keen follower of Benedict Anderson. And I do think that in many ways, in the minds of a lot of the young people I was talking to, they are imagining a Hong Kong nation. But it's obviously very early days. This is a small group of people, although we should remember in the Legislative Council election, something like 20% of people voted for candidates or parties advocating some form of independence or self-determination loosely defined. And there are many Hong Kongers who obviously embrace their role within China, or many who don't question it. But I think among a certain subset of young people, they are imagining a Hong Kong nation. One very interesting thing is that Benedict Anderson talks about to be a nation, you have to kind of write your own history. And these young Hong Kongers have started to do that. If you look at Joshua Wong and his Demosisto group, they have a project they've been crowdfunding for to go back into the archives and write their own version of Hong Kong's history. Not the history of the British and the humiliations of the British, not Chris Patton lecturing them, certainly not the Chinese government or the Hong Kong government, their own version. And in many ways for them, that is the first step to creating a nation in their minds. Obviously the question of whether it's a good idea or whether they will ever have a state is completely separate from that.
Okay, this gentleman in the middle, please.
Excuse me, my name is John Antweiler. I have been a banker for the last 40 years. I'm retired now. And I have a question, and I'd like to follow it up with a comment. My question is, when you talk to Generation Hong Kong, how much of what you observed would you rack up to the natural, youthful impatience of all young people, and how much would you say reflects a certain amount of being spoiled children? And my comment is that when I first came to Asia, came to Hong Kong, working for a bank, almost every single position of any responsibility was held by an expat or somebody who was trained in Australia, trained in India, or trained in America or Britain. Today, there are very few expats. The trading floors, the administration are all Hong Kong Chinese. They are doing very well. They've moved in, they've replaced the expats. And so there has been at least in my limited environment, quite a lot of progress. And I'm older, so I'm used to things taking time. So I'm just wondering whether you could talk about impatience and to what extent expectations are, hey, I came from a special place and I deserve a special position.
Well, I think that's one of the questions that's simply unanswered, right? It's too early to know. In 20 years' time, will you walk into your HSBC branch in Hong Kong and go to get a loan, and the manager, Joshua Wong, will, look through your documents, give you a loan, and you'll say, thank you, and off you go. I mean, we don't know, right? Everywhere in the world, of course, young people tend to be more outspoken, more radical in their political views, and there's this trend to become more conservative. What I'd say, and what I was hinting at when I mentioned the Occupy comparison, wasn't to directly compare those protest movements, but that I think at a time when in many places in the world people are worried about apathetic youth, these young people who I've spoken to have gone to exceeding lengths, to fight for what they believe in. They've taken a lot of brickbats. I think some of them are in court today. They're facing many, many court cases. They've been threatened. Their communications have been monitored. They've been beaten up. I don't think these are just annoying young people who are impatient. I mean, that's what people said about Occupy. And then when it finished, everyone thought, okay, now those kids have learned their lesson. But then they came back even stronger. So I think I wouldn't write off what's happening. But of course, maybe they'll just grow more conservative with age. We'll have to see. I mean, one thing I would say on that point was when Joshua Wong was on the cover of Time magazine, I think he was 18 during the height of Occupy, he gave some quote to Time like, we're kids, we're on the streets, we never want to be, wearing business suits and giving out business cards. And a year and a half later, as some of you probably saw, he was in this very spot, in a suit, handing out business cards in his new guise as, a politician fighting for office.
Thanks very much. Tara Joseph with the American Chamber of Commerce. A lot of the undertone of today's conversation is about a generation that's really yearning for expression and identity. And everything we're seeing still doesn't suggest that they're going to have that, the way things are shaping up. So in terms of the interviews that you did for the book, did you get a sense that the fight is over, or people are really still struggling to figure this out and will continue to fight for it?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, things are moving so fast, right? So I think the September Legislative Council election was a high point of hope, and then the very swift ousting of Bajio Leung and the other young inspiration lawmaker kind of put an end to that. So people are undecided. I mean, I met Bajio Leung recently for a chat, and he said, well, it's great we're creating this identity, but what's the point of an identity without hope? Which nationalist has ever achieved anything unless their supporters have had hope? And he's a guy who's facing various criminal charges. He's also facing probable bankruptcy because of the fees he's going to have to pay. So I think he's struggling to give a hopeful view to his supporters. So I think it's difficult. I mean, also, when you talk about freedom of expression, it's not just about politics. I have a chapter in here called The Banned Artists. No surprises what that one's about, in which I speak to some of the young artists who've been trying to push back and really having their work stymied, in many cases by self-censorship, not by overt censorship. So I spoke to the directors of 10 Years, the sensational low-budget film imagining a very bleak future for Hong Kong that won the Best Film Award, was selling out every day, and then like that disappeared from all the cinemas, and the directors were unable to get a single cinema in Hong Kong to show it. Largely because people feared it was going to impact their business in China. Perhaps they'd been told by the liaison office they weren't allowed to show it. They don't know. And one of the directors, a guy called Jevons Au, who then made a second award-winning film called Trivisa, I said to him, oh, hey, Jevons, isn't it great? You've got all these tensions in Hong Kong. It's perfect for making movies. Like, you must be over the moon. And he just said to me, well, I don't want to make good films and live in a shit city.
Okay, so we're running out of time. Maybe two last ones together, if we could. This gentleman here, and then we'll take take one from the table in the corner, okay? And those two last ones, yeah.
Okay, hi, this is Holton, member of FCC. I have a question. In your research, have you contacted or researched on another two group of people? Two group of young people. One is those are mainland exchange students study at the colleges in Hong Kong right now. As another group is also from mainland, but they're young professional, but they graduated from the school in the UK or US, but now they came to Hong Kong within the past 10 years and are working in Hong Kong. Have you see how they feel about all these things here, or you know?
So it was mainland students who studied abroad, and the first group you mentioned was
the young mainland students who are now studying in the Hong Kong colleges, surrounded by all these disgruntled local students,
I don't have a chapter on it in the book, but I had some experience of talking to them, I'd say. I think it's a tense time on Hong Kong campuses, as I'm sure you've read or you'll know from talking to students, that they've really been swept by a sort of wave of radicalism, and this idea of the Hong Kong nation is really coming strong on the campuses. So I think some of the mainland students, and this isn't in any way representative, but just some of the people I happen to know, friends and others, do feel nervous. They feel not very welcome. I have heard of cases where people have had sort of notes put under the door saying "Go home, mainlander." I'm not saying that that's a common practice or widespread, but there's certainly a tension there. But as I mentioned, the story in the Wall Street Journal was also talking about mainland professionals who are embracing Hong Kong's freedoms. But of course, many of those people don't necessarily want to speak up too much about how they're enjoying the free life here as opposed to the issues they face back at home. And in terms of Chinese students who studied in Europe and America and other places, well, it just depends. I think people are very diverse and they have different views. There are certainly plenty of people who've gone to Harvard and Oxford and are still, convinced nationalists and supporters of the Communist Party of China who are dismayed by what's happening in Hong Kong. But I'm sure there are many who also just don't care or, maybe support the idea of democracy.
Okay, then the final question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Fang Qiang, working with the Chinese Foreign Ministry's Commissioner's Office in Hong Kong, and I would come up with one comment, probably a couple of short comments, and then with one question. So today I thank you, Ben, for sharing with us this one section of your newly published book, and though we do not agree with the opinions expressed in this one section, we will probably get one copy, and probably the whole series of the book, to have a careful read. And from what you said today, my feeling is that you gave us a rather pessimistic picture of the future, saying that the Hong Kong young people and the central government are on a collision course. Even the name of your presentation saying that finding that identity in China's shadow, telling that sense of pessimism. But I think that a kind of sunshine mentality needs to be adopted in order to have a right understanding of this issue of great complexity. I think the youth issue is an issue of complexity, not only in Hong Kong, but also in mainland and also in other parts of the world as well. And also in your presentation, you mentioned the result of the one opinion poll of the Hong Kong University. But there's also another opinion poll done by the Chinese University of Hong Kong saying that there is a drastic drop of the number of young people supporting Hong Kong independence. So I think when talking about opinion polls, still a holistic approach needs to be adopted, in particular in viewing this issue of great complexity. And so I've also noticed that in your presentation today and in your recent reports, you mentioned the names of the young activists, for example, Joshua Wong, and also in your reports, you mainly quoted the opinions of the young activists such as Joshua and also Sixtus Liu. But from our experience of engaging with the young people of Hong Kong, we find that only a minority of the young people are keen on political activism, while the majority of them are working very hard to trying to secure a sound economic livelihood for the future, to find a better job in this competing economic environment. And I believe this is also the opinion reflected in many local media as well. So the question is, you want to give people the impression that this small number of people are the majority. Don't you think that it is a kind of a deviation from the principle of fairness and objectivity as a journalist working for an international mainstream media? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, you definitely took me up on the fiendishly tough recommendation, so I have to thank you for that. Well, I'd say my book is really a series of portraits of young people in Hong Kong. It's not a work of political science, and as you say yourself, of course, polls say different things. I mean, one important clarification is, when I talk about the Hong Kong identity, that's not the same as support for Hong Kong independence. My book is not about Hong Kong independence, and as I think I said to the gentleman over here, there's definitely a big difference between imagining a Hong Kong community of people or a nation together, feeling the same things, working together for the same solutions, and the legal requirements or legal calls for a separate state. So I think there's two different things there. But yeah, I've tried to be scrupulously fair. I've tried to speak to as many different people as I can, but there are other views. I think that's why we have debates. That's why I wrote the book, to generate debate. And I think if people have alternative views, they should write about them and speak up. I think it's important. I mean, the other thing I'd say is, you said people should have a more sunshine view. I think I'll quote the words here of Lam Meng-Wai, the head of the government's youth commission. He's also an advisor to Carrie Lam. He said one of the problems is that when the Chinese government tries to communicate to young people in Hong Kong, it's at a different frequency. So he says that Hong Kong people receive information at a frequency more like the West. So when the Chinese government is talking to Hong Kong young people, they don't hear it. So I think the challenge for China, and obviously Xi Jinping was talking about patriotic education, and for the Hong Kong government, is to find a way to engage with people that they receive. I think that's certainly possible, and it's about finding the right method of communication. But yeah, I'd just like to reiterate, it's a series of portraits. I think it reflects the people I've spoken to, but I wouldn't say it reflects other people who I didn't speak to. But yeah, please, do read the book and do write your opinions on what you think, should happen in Hong Kong, because I'm sure people are interested to hear more about what the Chinese government thinks.
Okay, well look, I'm afraid we're out of time now. You heard Ben. Please do read the book. It's available at the front desk. Ben is here. I just have one final ceremonial duty, which is to give Ben a small gesture of thank you from the FCC for coming along. Ben, thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.